thank you so much for taking the time to attend my presentation. As some of you know, I am currently attending Trinity Theological College to receive master's degrees in Christian apologetics and philosophy. This recorded presentation is actually an assignment for one of my classes, whereby I was instructed to make a video of myself giving an apologetics sermon or an apologetics instructional video. And since I didn't think it would be particularly interesting to see me talking for 30 to 40 minutes, I chose death by PowerPoint. So hopefully it will keep you all engaged. Now, this presentation is going to be posted on YouTube and as well as the Open Door website. So you can review the information that I talk about, all that I discuss here tonight at your own convenience. So I was originally contemplating on what exactly I would talk about for my assignment related to apologetics. I could just discuss the field of apologetics, what it entails, and how it should be best applied. But I understand that for many, apologetics is something that they don't think it's very interesting, or they think it's way too hard for them to grasp. Apologists, we use a lot of sophisticated language to describe usually really easy to understand concepts. And so really it's just the apologists that make apologetics confusing. But the concepts are actually very easy to understand. So the last thing I want you to do is cognitively check out because you think you can't understand this. You can't understand this. And I'm going to do my best to make sure it's really easy to grasp. So if you have any questions with anything that I say tonight, write them down if you have paper or your phone. And don't hesitate to ask me anytime afterwards. It doesn't have to be tonight. It can be anytime afterwards. All right. So let's start with the very first word that some of you may be aware of or may not be aware of, apologetics. It comes from the Latin word apologia, meaning simply to give a defense for something. So it's not like you're apologizing for your faith. It's really when anyone tries to defend or argue for a certain position. So for instance, if you were to say to your friend, who do you think makes a better revolver, Ruger or Smith & Wesson? And you give your reasoning for Smith & Wesson, for why it's a better revolver, that would be, you're giving your apologetic for that. So I'm going to ask or begin with the same question that I asked way back when I announced I would be teaching apologetics some years back. And that is, and I do want to see some answers like raising hands or whatever. If someone were to randomly come to you on the street and give all these reasons like, Christianity is completely false, on the spot, do you think you'd be able to defend your faith adequately? Good. So the great thing that God has blessed us with is that we do have a myriad of different avenues and evidence by which we can use to uphold and defend our belief in the face of a non-believing world. Many things that we can point to that gives us good reasons that Christianity is true, and we don't have to check our brain at the door to become a Christian. The Greek word for faith, as it is used in Scripture and among the writings of the Church Fathers, is pistis, meaning believing in something because of the reliable evidence presented for it. In other words, we do not have a faith that is blind. The whole point of faith is that you have good reason to have the faith to begin with. And something that every Christian, above everything else, should make a priority to study, understand, and defend is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what we're going to talk about today. 1 Corinthians 15 says, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain. Your faith also is in vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God because we testified against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise. If in fact the dead are not raised, for if the dead are not raised, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. So my intention is to lay out that evidence, arguing for its validity, combating the objections made against it, and ultimately showing you as Christians that you have really good reason to believe in what you believe. In my case of the resurrection, I am not going to assume any divine inspiration of the New Testament to establish my arguments. However, I'm also not going to omit it as if it doesn't count as evidence at all, because the New Testament letters should not be excluded just because they deal with religious matters. They are still historical documents. For the most part, I'm going to rely on the historical and forensic evidence agreed on by the vast majority of historians and scholars, both religious and secular, whereby even if most of the New Testament is just a fabrication, it was just imagined, it would not discredit the main force of the arguments. So I'm going to begin by establishing three pertinent facts that are agreed on by nearly every historian who has studied the event in question. 1, Jesus of Nazareth existed and died by crucifixion outside of Jerusalem by Pontius Pilate. 2, shortly after, an empty tomb was discovered after Jesus had been placed inside. 3, the apostles and many others claimed to witness him physically alive. So the first claim is attested by nearly all New Testament scholars and historians, with E.P. Sanders regarding it as an almost indisputable fact. Bart Ehrman, perhaps the most famous atheistic New Testament scholar, I'm going to be sourcing him a lot today, he even affirms that the existence and death of Jesus is the most grounded historical fact of the ancient world. The second claim is also largely undisputed by scholars. Gary Habermas, perhaps the leading scholar on the resurrection, has surveyed the material written by scholars and has reported that 75% conclude the tomb was empty on Easter morning. The third fact is that the apostles claimed that Jesus appeared again to them alive. However, most appearances that the historians affirm are not the same ones that are found in the Gospels. What they will do is they will instead that the disciples must have seen something, but they are oblivious as to what it could be. Now, with these facts comes a myriad of different questions that need to be answered. With these answers requires a narrative that best explains the data in scope of power, plausibility, and least ad hoc. For those of you who don't know what ad hoc means in philosophy, it means that you're positing new theories to save your original theory from being falsified. We don't want to do that. And delving into these facts further begins to limit the scope of what could have occurred. So, we can state with full confidence that Jesus was a real figure, and it's quite clear that anyone who suggests otherwise is left out of the room. I have plenty of sources from all historians that say that Jesus Christ was a real person. Now, of the few that do hold this view, the most prominent other number is Robert Price, who is a qualified Bible scholar, but he is no longer working at an accredited institution. And most famously, Richard Carrier. I'm sure most of you have heard of him. He has a PhD in ancient history, but he has never, ever held an academic position in the field. I'd like to point out really quick that Richard Carrier is, although he's most famous as a Jesus myther, he's not technically so. He just believes it is a very plausible idea, but I don't want to say that that is his personally held belief. It's just something that he is willing to posit as a potential theory. Moving on to the second claim, I'd like to address the 25% that disagree that Jesus was not placed in a tomb. Among them is John Dominic Crossan, infamous for his radical approach to matters of eschatology. Again, for those who don't know what eschatology means, it just means end-time events. He is known for validating non-canonical works, and he believes that Jesus was thrown into a ditch rather than buried in a tomb. And the reason he gives is because he believes the Romans would not have permitted a burial. And there are, I believe, a lot of attestations of evidence that fly in the face of this theory. First, the word used for bury relating to Jesus' resting place is ataf, rather than apopletos, which would not have been used as a word to dump bodies into a trench. Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb according to all known sources, both scripturally and secularly. Second, Jewish law demanded that foreigners and criminals had to be buried. That Josephus quote is evidence of that. The Romans are actually shown to allow many Jewish practices even though they were a vassal state. So practices such as keeping the Sabbath or conducting their own trials, temple worship, even having their own temple guards. So there's really no logical or historical basis to think that they wouldn't allow a less severe request. Also, the tomb that the earliest sources testify to is not just some ordinary tomb. It's the tomb of a Sanhedrin member, Joseph of Arimathea, indicating that the location was well known and could be investigated. In fact, we have good reason to suggest that we know where it is today. That right there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's obviously renovated, but often considered to be very close to the actual location of where they placed his body. Now, this would have been very dishonorable to Christ's followers, considering that the same group had just murdered their Lord. Despite this, the Jews consistently stated that they were unable to find the body. In fact, the most common objection to the empty tomb, written in Matthew 28:13, was that, well, the disciples must have stolen the body. Well, that's already an admission that they couldn't find the body. They didn't know where it was. Rome would eventually set out a decree to find the missing body and to punish any future accounts of grave robbery according to the Nazareth inscription. I know that's a lot to read, so I'm just going to summarize for you. It's basically a declarative ordinance that states anyone caught grave robbing will be dubbed a tomb breaker and thus suffer capital punishment, aka death. So it looks like from all sides, no one had the body of Christ. Last, let's address the claims of Jesus appearing to many different people. Multiple sources affirm this in Paul's epistles: Mark, John, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and Josephus. Further, he also appeared to skeptics like his own brother James and Paul, which virtually all scholars would affirm were not followers of Christ prior. Paul affirms this as well, citing an early creed in Galatians 1, 22 to 23. And this meets the criteria of embarrassment, since Paul was considered to be one of the worst persecutors of the early church. As for James, both Paul and Josephus attest that he was the leader of the Jerusalem church and was not a follower of Christ prior, according to Antiquities 29:1. So, considering the amount of data that surrounds these appearances of Jesus, certain theories have been presented to account for the information. Generally, there are 4 theories that are most speculated. The conspiracy theory, meaning the disciples deceptively crafted a narrative that Jesus rose from the dead when he really did not. The legend theory, the events and miracle claims made about Jesus were all later developed legends, not made by early eyewitness testimony. The hallucination theory, the disciples and others experienced hallucinations that Jesus had risen and were convinced enough to start a new religion founded on this belief. The resurrection theory, which is obviously the one that I hold to, Jesus Christ rose from the dead and physically appeared to many. To determine what is most probable, I'm going to present 4 different cultural details of the first century that not only have been observed by many theologians in the biblical narrative, but also accepted and affirmed by most historical scholars. The first, the expectation of the gospel of the surrounding world. The Christians preached the Gentiles to worship a Jewish carpenter that was shamefully executed through crucifixion. The Romans looked down on both the Jews and the occupation, with Cicero describing it as equivalent to vulgar slavery. Most importantly, they were preaching his bodily resurrection, an idea that was detested by most pagans that even believed in an afterlife. A lot of them did not, because they believed the purpose of death was to escape the universe and then ascend to the spiritual realm. The Christians, like the Jews, would preach a spiritual and physical kingdom brought down to earth, which was not something the pagans had even hoped for. In addition, they also placed ethical demands and moral standards that were counter to what pagans would have wanted, such as abolishment of temple prostitution or equality for women. I'll read this one quote from David A. De Silva. Christianity was founded on a premise that should have failed the moment it began in such a culture. Now, the Jews also believed that the message of Christ was embarrassing because it thwarted all understandings of their expectations as well. For one, with Joseph not being regarded as his own father, kingly lineage would have been called into question, though I will say it doesn't seem like anyone ever actually addressed this by his opponents. They thought the Messiah was supposed to be a conquering king who would overthrow their enemies rather than be slain by them. The Messiah would eventually lead them into the eschaton, culminating in the Pharisaical Jewish belief of a mass resurrection of all the saints into an eternal kingdom. This concept is heavily grounded not just in the Bible, but also found in many other cultural writings detached from Scripture, like the Sibylline Oracles, the Talmud Sanhedrin, and the Apocalypse of Moses. So even though the Christians firmly believed in a present spiritual kingdom, followed by a restorative kingdom made up of believers, it also went against the ethical Jewish restoration that the Pharisees had been teaching. Christianity was born into a world where its central claim was known to be ridiculous, and the early Christians knew it themselves. It's not that they thought resurrection might just happen to a few people here and there, but they said it had happened in this case. This claim seemed absolutely crazy. The second fact that I'm going to bring up is one that you probably are already aware of, the low testimony of women. The Talmud states, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Now, people are going to try and object to this, but they do so only from the point of the second century. And that was the only time where women could attest in court, but they could only attest for 2 things. They could only attest that I was a virgin during my marriage to my husband, and my husband had died, so now I'm a widow. Those are the only 2 things that they really could account for. And according to the Gospels, the women were the first to report the findings of the empty tomb. This fact was utterly embarrassing for the early church, with the apostles in Luke stating that they didn't even trust them to begin with. Also, have you noticed that the earliest sermons and the creeds found in your scriptures, they don't even mention the women? They're not even talked about. This isn't a contradiction in the Gospels, more so a matter that largely remained in silence because it was an embarrassing fact for them. Given the surrounding culture, this is not something that you would ever make up as an ancient writer. Celsus, a popular early critic of the church, whom Origen often opposed, actually attacks the biblical narrative in this instance, specifically stating that the report was first told by a half-frantic woman. N.T. Wright, a prolific N.T. scholar, claims that if these stories had been made up even 5 years later, the disciples would have never thought to place Mary Magdalene in the center role of being the first to discover the empty tomb, as that would be equivalent to shooting themselves in the foot due to the societal view of women's testimonies. So if you were making it up, you probably would have said, well, Nicodemus was the first one to find it, or one of the apostles was the first one to find it. You wouldn't have said that Mary Magdalene or any other woman was the first one to find it if you were making it up. So because it comes with embarrassment, it is more than likely that it is true. Third, the voluntary suffering of witnesses. Now, there are multiple attestations from Christians and non-Christian sources that testify that the early witnesses were persecuted and martyred for their faith. Luke records in Acts various incidents of other Christians being physically oppressed for their faith, and Paul also attests to suffering under severe persecution on numerous accounts. Here are some secular sources. I've listed some examples, like Tacitus recalling Nero's persecution of the Jews in his annals. And Clement of Rome talks about how Paul and Peter were martyred in Rome for their faith. According to Josephus, Clement of Alexandria, and others, they construct this narrative that James was actually martyred by first being thrown off the temple because he refused to recant that his brother was the Messiah. He actually survived that fall, and when they found him, High Priest Ananus stoned him to death. So he really went out pretty bad. Here's a passage from 2 Corinthians. The reason I put this up here is because 2 Corinthians is actually regarded as a letter responding to the Corinthian church, who asked Paul to provide evidence that God was actually on his side because of the inordinate amount of persecution he was receiving. All that to point out that the earliest believers were going to their deaths because of their newfound faith in something they actually experience. And it's highly improbable that many would be martyred willingly for a lie they concocted and knew to be false. Finally, the fourth cultural detail that is affirmed is one that may not seem very important to you, but it's actually a pretty big deal, and that is the attestation of their foundational roots in Jerusalem. So it seems like a minor detail, but it's actually extraordinary because it doesn't make sense for the disciples to be adamant about their foundation in Jerusalem if the Jews were already trying to destroy them. Furthermore, it doesn't make sense for them to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus in an area where they could be disproven. Tacitus writes, well, I'm not going to quote that because it's pretty long, but you can see it right there. What cults often do in circumstances like this is they will gather up their followers and then they will move them to a new hub base, and they'll cut ties from their origins. That's something that the Church of Scientology does when they recruit new converts. They'll try to convince them to get into their special military, and they'll put them on a ship out in the ocean, and they will live there their entire lives. And they'll try to indoctrinate them. Same thing that happened with Joseph Smith when he rerouted his followers to Missouri and Illinois. It was all because, hey, they're kind of finding out that we're a hoax, so we got to move. But Paul didn't do that. Instead, he went to various regions to set up churches, and then he left. This allowed more churches to build more churches, and primarily in heavily populated areas. Unexpectedly, Christianity grew rapidly within a few decades after Jesus' death, spreading throughout the Roman Empire and becoming a major force in the world. And this indicates that the Christian movement was not one that attempted to hide from the public sphere, but rather they were evangelistic in their approach, open about their beliefs, and held conviction to its historical claims. So now that I've gone over some important cultural details, there are others that I could offer, but we're going to stick to these four just for right now. Let's see how each of these theories that I mentioned earlier, how they stand up in the face of the evidence. First, the conspiracy theory. So many skeptics are going to often object to the biblical account by asserting that the gospel writers just made up the whole thing, and that Christians like us are just gullible for believing it. Some will often try to claim that the resurrection, instead of sharing close identities with Pharisaical thought, was borrowed from paganism. So let's go into that idea. First, it should be noted that Greek philosophy and Greek mythicism often portrayed itself separate from each other. So allow me to explain that. You're going to hear from many historians that the Greeks had no belief in a bodily resurrection. And generally, this claim is true. Jan Bremer, a famous historian, says bodily resurrection is an unthinkable idea among the Greeks. Also, when reading famous Greek literature, such as Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, there are strong conceptions of death being the finality of one's soul, often believing that once the soul departs from the flesh, it travels to outer darkness with no hope of ever returning. Homer's Iliad quotes, "But when the dust has drawn up the blood of a man, once he is dead, there is no resurrection." Perhaps one of the more famous Greek stories in the West is the tale of Hercules. He descends to the underworld to rescue Alcestis. But even in this narrative, He's never conveyed to have a bodily resurrection, really by either character, but merely a resuscitation only to eventually die again. So the belief by these historians, it doesn't come out of a vacuum. One cannot really be blamed for thinking that this is the case. But just because we find instances of no resurrection in Homer's Iliad, that doesn't mean it entails that we can extend it to the Greek mind more broadly. As famous historian Dag Enzo writes, Greek thinking is often considered to be identical with its philosophical tradition, but most classic scholars today acknowledge that the philosophical tradition at no time held a monopoly over Greek minds. So to put it in a way that you might understand, Kenneth Copeland, I'm sure you all know him. He preaches a prosperity gospel. Now, if someone were to read him and say, well, he's got a large influence, you would be wrong to say that what he is saying attributes to all of what Christians believe. That doesn't follow. So there are other stories seen in the Roman world that could relate to resurrection. Some of the most famous Greek philosophers like Plato and Cicero did not hold to a pessimistic view of death. They both wrote respectively about the possibility that the soul is immortal, but it evolves, it metamorphosizes into different states, it then travels to new planes of existence after death. Some of those stories, like Sextus Empiricus, mentioning 3 different stories of Alcepius having the power to raise the dead. Justin Martyr even compares the concept of resurrection to the sons of Jupiter in his Apology. So the fact is that there were various Greek beliefs within the Greco-Roman culture. You really couldn't just pin one concept from a Greek philosopher and say, well, that's the consensus. So the question is, instead of denying that, well, the Greeks just had no concept of bodily resurrection, the question really is, what is the context by which they understood resurrection to be? And that's where the similarities between Christ and others are shown to be fallacious. So perhaps the most popular god that is compared to Christ in his resurrection is Dionysus. You'll notice on the slide that I have many different negative statements about Dionysus, such as that he wasn't born of a virgin, that he didn't hang on a tree to die, and he wasn't called King of Kings. The reason I've done this is because these are comparisons that are made to connect Dionysus with Jesus that are just false. They're not true. Growing up, I had a great interest in mythology, and I had read a great deal of it. When I first heard that people were comparing gods like Horus, Krishna, or Dionysus to Christ, acting like he copied these gods, I was genuinely confused. And I was right to be, because nearly all the similarities connecting them to Christ were just completely erroneous. So, as I said before, they will compare Dionysus' resurrection to Christ's. I'm going to read to you what Dionysus' actual resurrection story is. Zagreus was a divine child of Zeus, as a snake, and his daughter Persephone. Hera became jealous because Zeus intended to make him his heir, so she jealously urged the Titans to attack the child while she dazzled him with toys. The Titans tore Zagreus to pieces and consumed him except for his heart. Athena ends up saving the child's heart and brought it to Zeus, who swallows it. Zeus reduces the Titans to soot with his thunderbolts, and from these remains arose the mortals. With the help of Semele, Zeus rebirths Zagreus from his heart, renaming him Dionysus. That doesn't sound anything like Christ's resurrection at all, in any way, except for the fact that they have the word resurrection in there, and that's the point. Even if people say, well, the concept of a resurrection can be found among them, it is never shown to be in the same way as Christ's body glorified resurrection as it's portrayed. Not only that, but these stories like Dionysus, they're understood to be myths, and they were treated like traditions rather than based in reality. So most of the Greco-Roman world, they would worship these gods, but purely out of tradition. It's not because they actually genuinely believed in them. Now, some might have, but the vast literate among them, they knew these were all myths. They did it purely out of tradition. It's like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. We know they're false, but we still celebrate those ideas anyway. All comparative linguistic analysis shows that the records about Jesus are historical literature. Subject matter is local. It has sometimes relatively mundane details, and it's contemporary. This isn't even a debate in the scholarly field. The only debate occurs on what type of history it is. Is it Greco-Roman biographies? Is it contemporary history or contemporary fiction? Other dying and rising gods are nothing like this. The resurrection of Christ was and is completely unique to the pagan world in its writing style, content, treatment, and overall culture. And if they did treat it just like another fable, then you should ask yourself, why are the people converting at a rapid rate and becoming exclusive to it, abandoning the other gods of the culture? Because mystery cults didn't do that. They would just add on to what they already believed. It was just additions. Um, these people were saying, no, we're worshiping him and him alone. And this is why historians do not accept the view that Jesus was just another dying and rising God, nor that the disciples borrowed from paganism in their resurrection claim. The theory has been universally abandoned in academia. And the only reason it is a very large view right now is solely due to the internet skeptics touting these fallacious argumentation online, like what we saw at Dionysus. So what about the Jewish expectation of resurrection? Because that would be really easy to, they must have just copied from that, right? As N.T. Wright points out, the understanding of resurrection was always understood as a re-embodiment, either donning the same body, revitalized, or a new body transformed. And this is why they were keen on burying their dead and preserving them. There are many Messiah claimants that we can trace back to Jesus' time. I've listed a few here. And what happened is when each of them died, this basically invalidated their claim to Messiahhood, because the Jewish understanding was that he would physically conquer their enemies, and they died, so obviously they didn't do that. And eventually their followers would abandon the cause and fizzle out as a group, and then they would go and look for a new Messiah. So the primary difference is that Christianity was the only societal sect that held to the claim that Jesus was the early notable exception, that he resurrected before all the saints at the end of time. A dying and rising Messiah was a completely unexpected concept for the Jewish mind. And they didn't treat it like a spiritual vindication, because even if they did, you would see that with like the Maccabean martyrs, you would see that with John the Baptist, you would see that with Moses. This claim was for like an actual bodily resurrection of one man. And while there are plenty of texts that Christians use to support the Messiah's death and rising again, like Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and Psalm 69, they were not understood in this way until after Jesus' resurrection. But I will say these passages are attributed to the Messiah. They just weren't understood as he will die and rise again. Interestingly, when reading through the Gospels and the epistles of Paul, they clearly pull from the Old Testament to establish their case that Jesus was the fulfillment of the law. But as N.T. Wright also points out, when they describe Jesus' resurrected state, they don't do that. They don't try to pull from the Old Testament to say this is what he looked like. In fact, they're very confused oftentimes by what he looks like. They're trying hard to comprehend and explain what it is they're looking at. And if the disciples were just, again, making up a story about the resurrected Messiah, you would expect them to try and pull from the Old Testament to establish the resurrection itself, especially being the main central claim of the faith. But let's forget all of that. Why is it implausible that they just didn't make this up? Because everything that I just said right now, technically they could have just thought of it. They could have just imagined it, and they made it up. And the reason is because the story they were advocating for gave them literally no advantage in the world. They received no financial benefit. It didn't award them any earthly power. It made them enemies of the Roman way of life. And furthermore, the Gospels reference so many different people by name. They mention locations and cultural icons that could be verified and checked. There were simply too many people involved for this to be a successful conspiracy and not have anyone recant or produce a body. And if it was so masterfully collaborated to deceive the entire Roman world, it would seem odd that the gospel writers, did not try to suppress any supposed discrepancies in the Gospels. They didn't try to unify them and like say, oh, you said this, well, I'll say the same thing. They came from independent sources, even though there are similar information that goes between them. The only thing that their claim of Christ's resurrection led to was painful consequences on multiple fronts. I'm going to state some here. Social hatred, excommunication, boiled alive. They were beheaded, they were disemboweled, and they were even fed to lions. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read that, but I will obviously put it up so you can look at it later. When we introduce other variables, the conspiracy theory just doesn't last as a valid option for very long. And you have to ask yourself, would you honestly choose to endure suffering like what I just mentioned, like the disciples' experience, for something that you knew to be a lie that you yourself created. And just no one would do that. You wouldn't sacrifice your life for something like that. On top of that, let's briefly examine Paul and James. So Paul's conversion is shown to be very early, considering the creed he cites in Galatians 3. And James, being a leader of the church, would not have been portrayed as a non-follower of Jesus. He wouldn't have been said that, well, he wasn't there when his brother died on the cross, nor would they say that he openly mocked him if this was contrived and made up by early believers. James and Paul really had no reason to lie. The Christian movement was only a small and persecuted group worshiping a Messiah who just died. And the only thing that they would expect is to be persecuted in the same way if they joined the group, especially in Paul's case where he already was a prominent member of society who hated the group. So, for these reasons, the conspiracy theory really has no way to account for these other factors, and thus is not a reasonable option to explain the inception of Christianity. This quote says, "The message about this Christ was incompatible with the most deeply rooted religious ideology of the Gentile world, as well as the more recent message propagated in Roman imperial ideology." Now, the legend theory, well, that fares even far worse. Even if the Gospels and Acts were written off as myths, we still have oral creeds and sermons that preserve what the early Christians believed, most notably in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. Now, you may have heard this before, that we have early creeds that date back to very early. I'm going to explain to you how they come to that conclusion. So, like this one, they believe that this creedal list dates within 3 years of Pentecost, and they do that through the way that it's structured. It's mnemonic, meaning that it's structured in a way that's easy to understand, like a rhyme or like a nursery rhyme kind of thing. It's easy to remember. And in the original language, I know this has a lot of words on it. The original language had about 50 words that made up this creed. It also mentions Cephas rather than Peter, which indicates an early date due to the use of his early name. These are two historians. The one on the left is James D.G. Dunn. He's a Christian. He says this tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death. The one on the right, Gerd Ludemann, he's an atheist, New Testament scholar. And he says the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Gerald O. Collins, a well-respected historian, himself says he does not know any credible historian that would propose this creed was written anywhere past the year 40. But the case against the legend theory it's even stronger than this. So the first letter to the Thessalonians is often considered by historical scholars as the very first epistle Paul ever wrote. Some may consider Galatians to be earlier, but critically at the high end of either's dating, they are thought to be written between 48 to 50 AD. Let me repeat that. The high end of their dating is 48 to 50 AD. So let's just roll with that just for charity. If you read 1 Thessalonians and Galatians, you'll notice that Paul uses terms like Son of God or Lord to refer to Jesus without clarifying what these words mean. And they're to a majorative Gentile audience, meaning that the letter begins with a strong inference that this church is already familiar with these terms. Now, take into consideration that Paul's conversion is largely considered to be 2 to 3 years after Christ's resurrection. Well, what happened within those 3 years? Well, we know that he was educated. He studied under Gamaliel, and someone who vehemently despised the Christian movement, which begs the question, why was Paul so angry? Because right now, the Gospels hadn't been written, and he hadn't written his epistles. So what is it that is making him hate this movement so much? According to even skeptical historians, including Bart Ehrman, Christian preaching started within 1 month of Christ's death. This preaching solidified into early creeds, and within those creeds, Christians from the beginning were calling him Messiah, Son of God. They were also affirming that he is of God's nature, sitting at the right hand of God and pre-existent. One of my favorites is the Christological hymn, Philippians 2, 6 through 11. In this creed, even going further as to say, well, he's God, they call him Lord. And that's actually more important than people saying that he's God. And the reason is because if you look in Exodus 3, one of my favorite verses in the Bible, actually, I am that I am. He's making a reference to his self-dependent existence. I am that I am in the Hebrew is Yahweh. That's how they would translate it. It is Yahweh. And out of respect for the name of God, the Jews were keen to substitute this name for Lord. In other words, to ascribe the title of Lord to Jesus means they literally believe him to be Jehovah. And what bolsters this attestation even more is that according to Catherine Hezer, a respected professor of Jewish cultural studies, 90% of Jesus' crowd was known to be illiterate. Why is that important? Because even with that early dating that I gave you, they were giving oral creeds before they were even written. So it's even earlier than that. Well, that leads into one of the most important statements expressed by scholars of the New Testament. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. In other words, the belief that Jesus was divine, pre-existent, co-equal with the Father, was the earliest theological understanding of the Christian's history. Other scholars also affirm this, like Martin Hengel and Larry Hurtado. So with such an incredibly short time frame, it is not surprising to discover that we have no other competing historical narrative of what happened to Christ. It doesn't exist. And even with this high Christology, the embarrassing details remain, like the women being the first eyewitnesses, humiliating details of the apostles, and Jesus' human weakness. It is unanimous in all sources that he died, was buried, and appeared afterwards to many people. One more detail that creates a hard lock on the Gospels and epistles for an early date is the reality of a single catastrophic event. Jesus predicts the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. I'm going to read you Luke 11, 29 through 30. Now, as the crowds were increasing, he began to say, "This generation is a wicked generation. It demands a sign, and so no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so will the Son of Man be to this generation." The sign of Jonah was that if Nineveh repented of their evil, God would relent in destroying them in 40 days. So it's an interesting coincidence that 40 years after 30 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, a few days before Passover. Yet no biblical writer mentions this. They don't ever mention that this was a fulfilled prophecy. And that makes it very unlikely that the Gospels and the epistles, they were written after 70 AD, because you would expect them to write about this. Well, he predicted this would happen, and here's where the prediction is fulfilled. But none of them do that. So with this extra information, we can determine it is impossible for it to be a progressively crafted legend. Even one of the world's leading Jewish rabbis, Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, stated that because of this evidence, the God of the Old Testament must have raised Jesus from the dead. And lastly, we arrive at the third proposed secular theory of what happened to Christ, the hallucination theory. Now, this was first suggested in the debate between Celsus and Origen in the 2nd century, and is actually the most commonly used theory proposed by atheists. So this is their main one. But I find that there are many problems with this conclusion. Considering that the appearances of Jesus happen primarily in group settings, and a group hallucination is an exceptionally rare occurrence, much less so when happening in succession. In fact, there is hardly any scientific evidence to support that group hallucinations actually do occur. Even when bereavement hallucinations do happen, they often occur because it's a mode of comfort. It's meant to calm the mind. But actually, most hallucinations that are reported that are not bereavement are actually very frightening on the person. They'll believe that spiders are crawling on them, or they'll believe that someone is trying to convince them to commit suicide. It's very, very nerve-wracking. And so you would have to suggest that all the disciples were having multi-mode hallucinations of the same events all at once, multiple times. Hallucinations with just one of those attributes of having, auditorial hearing and vision, they're so improbable that it would have to be a miracle to cause just one of them. Dr. Joseph Bergeron, a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation with over 3 decades of experience in the medical field, states in his article, "The Resurrection of Jesus, a clinical review of psychiatric hypotheses for the biblical story of Easter," hallucinations are the symptom, not the diagnosis. And these often are grouped into 3 different types of etiology. Psychophysiological, meaning that there is a malfunction in the brain structure. There is psychobiochemical, something that chemically occurs in the brain, so like hallucinogenic drugs, that would usually cause that, and psychodynamic hallucinations involving a mental illness with psychosis intruding the conscious mind. He concludes that the disciples could not fall into any of these categories because the appearances happened within a limited scope of time rather than a constant occurrence. If they had a mental malfunction, they wouldn't stop seeing him. They would continue to see him over and over again, even later on in their life, but they only saw him in a very brief amount of time. And even if they were under drugs, say that they just got high, for so many to report the same exact experience would be near impossible to begin with. And not only that, it would not constitute a dramatic life change for all of them once they came out of the high. And lastly, regarding psychodynamic hallucinations, he says, persons suffering from psychosis in Jesus' time, not having benefit of modern medical treatment, might well be considered lunatics or demon-possessed. They would be unlikely candidates to organize a group and implement the rapid and historical expansion of the Christian religion during the first century. In other words, if they were crazy, they wouldn't convince anyone. You would not think that they would convince anybody. So many medical journals relating to the study of hallucinations usually provide three main criteria that would deem a group hallucination to be plausible: the expectation of the event, the emotional excitement, and they had to have been informed beforehand. But even with this, they are thinking that, well, the reporting would be widely varied even if these requirements were met. So take, for instance, I'm sure you all have heard of this, the miracle at Fatima. This is a possible group hallucination that was recorded in the Portuguese newspaper. And it says 3 Catholic children attested to seeing an appearance of the Virgin Mary as an apparition. And the crowd, however, they did not see the Virgin Mary, but they reportedly witnessed light phenomenon. They would see a pinwheel of colors emanating from the sun. They would see that the sun morphed into a hurtling disc and started flying everywhere. Pretty crazy stuff, but the last part of this quote says, thousands of others present there did not see anything unusual at all. So one could really reasonably, if you were just going by a naturalistic explanation, they were just looking at the sun for a long time. That's really all that you would have to say about that. The disciples' experiences were nothing like this, since they self-attested to not understanding Jesus' resurrection until after his post-mortem appearance. They were afraid when first encountering him, and even doubted the women when they first told them. James, while more than likely was grieving for his brother, he had no expectation that he would rise from the dead. In fact, him being dead would have convinced him more that he wasn't the Messiah. And Paul neither had the grief nor the expectation to justify having a hallucination of the Lord that physically struck him blind. It wasn't this, oh, I see like a sun dancing around. It struck him blind for a good amount of time. What also distinguishes the disciples' experience from the experience at Fatima is that the disciples reported that Jesus was appearing to them bodily. He was not an ethereal form. He was slightly different. He displayed new powers. And none thought that they were seeing visions, as they are shown to be able to tell the difference between a vision and Christ's appearance. And later, after the disciples had their own experience of the risen Jesus, Peter proclaims this. Again, I'm not going to read the entire quote, but he basically proclaims the witness to the events surrounding Jesus of Nazareth, stating that all the prophets testify of him, that through his name everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins. C.H. Dodd, a Welsh New Testament scholar, has pointed out that the speeches proclaimed in Acts, like this one, seem to also be orated very early like the rest of the creeds. And what this all shows is that from the earliest sources, Jesus was said to have appeared in group settings over a period of time. Gert Ludemann, again, an atheistic New Testament scholar that I quoted earlier, says this: "We have no sound way to place the symbolic interpretation of Jesus' resurrection within the context of earliest Christian resurrection belief." That's an atheist who's saying this. Now, despite the plenty of textual evidence, including over 25,000 preserved New Testament manuscripts regarding Jesus Christ, skeptics are going to still assume that we just can't know what Jesus really said. As Sir Frederick Kenyon writes, the number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church, it is so large that it is practically certain the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other book in the world. The belief that we don't have reliable testimony of the events of Jesus is mistakenly influenced by one of Bart Ehrman's famous sayings, "There are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament." And guess what? He's absolutely correct. That is a very true statement. However, there are two things that one should know in order to clarify the context of what is being said. As Daniel B. Wallace, a Christian New Testament scholar who has worked with Bart for many, many years, has said, no classical Greek or Latin text has nearly as many variants because they don't have as nearly many manuscripts. With virtually every new manuscript discovery, new variants are found. If there was only one copy of the New Testament in existence, it would have 0 variants. Well, guess what? Bart agrees. To be sure, of all the hundreds of thousands of textual changes found among our manuscripts, most of them are completely insignificant, immaterial, of no real importance for anything other than showing that scribes could not spell or keep focused any better than the rest of us. So we can be very confident that what we have in our Bibles today is the same message that the apostles proclaimed in the earliest days of the church. And that also, because we have all these manuscripts, we can identify what was included. For instance, the longer ending of Mark 16, 9 through 20, or the story of the woman caught in adultery. That was an inclusion. Or the Yohanin Kama, the 1 John 5:7 passage where it says, there are 3 that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and these 3 are one. That was an inclusion. It's not actually in the earliest manuscripts. Other skeptics will say that the narratives must be false because no other secular source mentions the resurrection event. Well, had others affirmed the resurrection event, they would have become Christians. And if they became Christians, they would have been deemed unworthy by the skeptics. So that, regardless of that circular reasoning, let's just get rid of that. Put it off to the side. Just because other sources don't mention the resurrection does not mean that it was fabricated. It is an unrealistic empiricist view that does not invalidate the preponderance of evidence that we do have. In fact, doing so would make virtually every historical event of antiquity that we take to be true vastly unsupported if we apply the same skepticism that we do to Christ's resurrection. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria has only one written source in the 4th century. Let's look at the Battle of Tours of 732 AD, where Christians conquered Muslim forces, totaling upwards of 350,000 deceased. This is only described in one chronicle written by a monk that wasn't even there. Or how about Ulysses S. Grant's diary? It doesn't once mention the Emancipation Proclamation. So we should just say that it never happened? No, we would be ridiculous to say that. How about the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 AD? It finds its only contemporary source in an Anglo-Saxon chronicle. There are plenty of omissions like these that come way later than Christ. If you notice, most of what I just said, these events happened after Christ. And we only have one source, or sometimes none. There are, however, several factors to consider as to why we don't have other sources of writings about Christ. For one, Bart Ehrman estimates that only 3% of the population in ancient Palestine could read, they could write, not read. Second, writings such as the Gospel of Matthew would have cost 5 denarii for each page, totaling in our modern time to be around $1,543 for the entire Gospel of Matthew. That doesn't include the cost of ink, doesn't include the time spent to write the document, which were often either written uncomfortably on the floor or in the lap. That's another weird thing. They didn't seem to have an understanding that they could write on tables. They wrote on the floor or in their laps. We don't have any evidence of them using tables for writing, which is very strange. Given how expensive and time-consuming this was, it is not surprising that different authors with different intentions, personalities, and points of view would tend to focus on some details about Christ more than others. For context, Matthew is written to Jews. Mark and Luke are writing to Rome, and John is writing to Ephesus. And that explains why Matthew's style in wordage is primarily Jewish, where other writings would not have that focus. It would actually seem more like collusion if all 4 gospel writers strictly copied each other on every detail to produce one manufactured story. Finally, most manuscripts in the form of papyri were not meant to last 2,000 years, but somewhere around 150 and 200 years. And that's why it is even more exceptional when we find documents or books from the 1st century, which we have very little of to begin with. And the ones that we do have are more than likely copies of the original. But despite all this, we have plenty of people who wrote about Jesus that were not Christians. I've listed some here. The Jewish historian Josephus, who lived in the 1st century AD, also wrote about Jesus and his followers. I'm not going to read it right now, but this quote that we have is largely criticized for how accurate its detail of Jesus is. However, there is no other evidence that indicates this quote is forged. As of right now, critics offer only speculation when contesting the validity of this passage. Working with these variables, the fact that we have more manuscripts of Jesus Christ than any other person in history is astonishing. No figure in ancient history has this much early evidence in their earliest projected life after they've lived. In conclusion, I find that the most popular secular theories fail to meet the requirements of being a plausible explanation for the affirmed data presented. The conspiracy theory cannot account for the quality of testimony that the disciples upheld even in the face of persecution and death. It doesn't account for the empty tomb, nor give proper reason as to why skeptics started converting to a well-known oppressed minority. There were way too many people involved for the conspiracy to be successful without recantation, and for a frightened minority to hide a body in a heavily crowded city and then make up an unexpected story that was counter to nearly every cultural sect just to get them killed is just preposterous to conceive. The legend theory fails because of the large number of facts that have been historically pinpointed to being close to Jesus' resurrection. There was too little time for it to have been made up as a later legend to which no one could verify. It isn't written as if they were myths, especially with retaining embarrassing details and apparent discrepancies in the narrative, and the transmission of the independent gospels from separate regions makes universal corruption impossible without notice. Lastly, the hallucination theory requires the person to believe that multiple people held multiple multi-sensory hallucinations of the same thing with such strength and conviction that they went to their deaths for it. This would also include the entire city of Jerusalem to be under the hallucination that there was an empty tomb. The more group hallucinations that you posit into this theory, the more it increases the unlikelihood, improbability, and general disregard for the data each time, until finally you have a theory that could only be the result of multiple miracles happening in rapid succession, as opposed to the one miracle claim that fits every aspect of the data, including the points the hallucination theory cannot account for. Still, some will assert that the resurrection is nevertheless more improbable, touting Humean philosophy that miracle claims are never to be believed regardless of the data because natural claims are always more likely than non-natural claims. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, consider that there are numerous documented cases of Jesus appearing to Muslims, numbers ranging between 2 to 7 million in just the past few decades. Or consider even more cases of near-death experiences involving Jesus with some of those claims identified in contemporary literature. The implications of Christ's resurrection still reverberate in modern-day reality, not just with dreams and experiences, but also with healing in foreign countries. And I'm not talking about hoaxes like you see in prosperity gospel churches. I'm talking about examples like this. All Christian churches in China practice some form of healing. In fact, according to some surveys, 90% of new believers cite healing as a reason for their conversion. This is especially true in the countryside where medical facilities are often inadequate or non-existent. While an answer may rely solely on naturalistic elements of common human experiences that we all share, that does not make it a more plausible or probable answer, especially when it doesn't answer any of the questions of the agreed upon data reliably. And if we are to still go with a theory just because it doesn't include a miracle, then we would be willfully blotting ourselves to the possibility of acknowledging the divine if it were actually true. Mind you, there is more evidence that attests to the validity of the resurrection narrative beyond what I presented here. As time progresses, we have uncovered more and more outside corroborative evidence that bolsters our belief to the point where if you were to look up modern debates involving did Jesus rise from the dead, you're going to find more than a few. You're going to find a lot actually. But I have yet to see a debate where the opponent of the Christian puts forth a new theory, defends it as a personally held belief they believe is better attested than the resurrection narrative. What they will often do is just say, well, I'm just not convinced. I'm just not convinced by the evidence, and it is your job as a Christian to convince me. Well, I can just say I'm not convinced all day long. Doesn't really matter. And your standard of belief for something doesn't mean that I should have the same standard. I think I have good reason as a Christian to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And this is the reason why I'm a Christian. Antony Flew, perhaps one of the most popular atheist philosophers to ever live, near the end of his life became a deist. It says this: the evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. Ignoring or rejecting evidence because it doesn't line up with your prior faith-based commitments is an approach that is largely condemned by atheists. So let's just say if one such atheist was to present you evidence for evolution and you deny the evidence because, well, I don't like how it makes me feel and what it might entail. Well, the atheist will say, well, you're irrational, you're anti-science. But let's say you bring up these historical facts in the same way to those atheists. And you're quickly going to find yourself in conversations about the latest socio-political hot-button issues, the violence of religious crusades, or the supposed unfairness of hell. These will all start entering the evaluation of whether Jesus rose from the dead. The evidence supporting the resurrection of Jesus is incredible, especially in relation to what we know of other people from his time, like Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor himself, High Priest Caiaphas, and Pontius Pilate. Eyewitness accounts, historical testimony, non-Christian sources, and the rapid growth of the early Christian movement all point to the reality of this event. The resurrection of Jesus has greater explanatory scope and power because it can answer all the data with the least amount of effort and the least amount of ad hoc, requiring only one supposition: God exists. Thank you for your time.